What started as a routine late-night interview turned into television chaos when Quentin Tarantino abruptly walked off Stephen Colbert's show following a heated exchange that left audiences stunned and social media erupting. The Late Show's studio buzzed with its usual pre-taping energy as crew members made final adjustments to the lighting and cameras. Stephen Colbert sat behind his desk reviewing his note cards one last time before the taping began. Tonight's guest was supposed to be a ratings goldmine. Quentin Tarantino, the legendary filmmaker known for his sharp wit and uncompromising artistic vision, was scheduled to discuss his latest project and reflect on his storied career. The audience settled into their seats, unaware they were about to witness one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. Colbert's production team had been particularly excited about this booking, seeing it as an opportunity to showcase the host's interviewing prowess with one of Hollywood's most intellectually formidable directors. As the show's familiar opening music played and Colbert delivered his monologue with his characteristic blend of political commentary and humor, everything seemed normal. The host was in his element, working the crowd with practiced ease. When he introduced Tarantino, the audience erupted in applause, clearly anticipating an engaging conversation between two sharp minds. Tarantino emerged from backstage with his typical confident swagger, dressed in a dark suit that seemed slightly rumpled in that deliberately casual way that had become part of his signature look. He waved to the audience, flashed his crooked smile, and settled into the guest chair with the relaxed demeanor of someone who had done countless interviews over his decades-long career. The conversation began pleasantly enough with Colbert asking about Tarantino's writing process and his thoughts on the current state of cinema. Tarantino, ever the passionate filmmaker, launched into an animated discussion about the craft of storytelling, gesticulating wildly as he spoke about the importance of authentic dialogue and character development. The audience was engaged, laughing at his colorful anecdotes and nodding along with his insights about the film industry. But the atmosphere began to shift when Colbert steered the conversation toward more controversial territory. With a slight smirk that his regular viewers would recognize as his setup for a more pointed line of questioning, Colbert leaned forward and brought up the ongoing debates about violence in cinema and its potential impact on society, a topic that had dogged Tarantino throughout his career. "Now, Quentin," Colbert said, his tone taking on a more serious edge, "you've faced criticism over the years about the level of violence in your films. Some people argue that movies like yours contribute to a culture that normalizes violence. How do you respond to those critics who say you have a responsibility to consider the broader social impact of your work?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and perceptive viewers might have noticed Tarantino's jaw tighten slightly. This wasn't the first time he'd been asked about violence in his films, and he'd grown increasingly frustrated with what he saw as a shallow, reductive approach to discussing his art. His response was measured, but carried an undercurrent of irritation. "Stephen, with all due respect, that's a question that fundamentally misunderstands what cinema is and what artists do," Tarantino replied, his voice remaining calm, but his eyes narrowing. "I'm not a social worker or a politician. I'm a filmmaker. My job is to tell stories that move people, that challenge them, that make them think and feel. The idea that I should water down my artistic vision because some people can't distinguish between fiction and reality is frankly insulting to both my intelligence and theirs." Colbert, perhaps sensing an opportunity to push harder, or maybe genuinely believing in his line of questioning, didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down with a follow-up that would prove to be a critical mistake. "But surely you can't deny that there's a difference between artistic expression and what some might call gratuitous violence," Colbert pressed. "When young people watch your movies, don't you think there's some responsibility to consider how that might influence their worldview?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Tarantino's relaxed posture stiffened, and his famous quick wit was replaced by something much more dangerous, genuine anger. The director leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a harder edge that longtime observers of his interviews would recognize as a warning sign. "You know what, Stephen? I'm getting really tired of this sanctimonious." Tarantino shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You sit there in your suit and tie making jokes about politicians and current events. But when a real artist comes on your show, you want to lecture them about responsibility. Where was your sense of responsibility when you were making jokes about serious issues that affect real people's lives?" The audience stirred uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the playful back and forth they were used to seeing on late-night television. The energy in the room had shifted dramatically, and it was clear that something had gone seriously wrong. Colbert, caught off guard by the intensity of Tarantino's response, tried to regain control of the situation with his usual deflecting humor. "Well, I think there's a difference between comedy and—" "No, there isn't," Tarantino interrupted, his voice now clearly audible to the entire studio audience. "You don't get to decide what's appropriate art and what isn't. You don't get to sit there and judge my work while hiding behind some fake moral high ground. You want to talk about influence? Let's talk about how your show influences people to think that complex issues can be reduced to punchlines and cheap applause breaks." The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and crew members could be seen shifting nervously behind the cameras. Colbert's face flushed red as he realized his attempt at damage control had backfired spectacularly. The host's trademark smugness began to crack, revealing something uglier underneath. Instead of trying to de-escalate the situation, he made the fatal decision to match Tarantino's intensity with his own brand of condescending hostility. "Listen, Quentin, I think you're being a little dramatic here," Colbert said, his voice dripping with the kind of dismissive tone that had made him enemies throughout his career. "We're just having a conversation about accountability and entertainment. If you can't handle legitimate questions about your work, maybe you're not as confident in your artistic choices as you pretend to be." The studio audience gasped audibly. Even those unfamiliar with Tarantino's temperament could sense that Colbert had just crossed a line that should never be crossed with any artist, let alone one of Tarantino's stature and reputation. The director's eyes flashed with a fury that made his previous anger look mild by comparison. "Excuse me." Tarantino's voice was dangerously quiet now, the kind of controlled rage that was far more threatening than shouting. "Did you just question my confidence in my own work? Did you just suggest that I can't handle criticism?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. "Stephen, I've been making movies since before you figured out how to read a teleprompter without looking like a deer in headlights. I've faced criticism from people far more intelligent and insightful than you could ever hope to be." The production assistant standing near the cameras frantically gestured to the director in the booth, clearly hoping someone would step in to salvage what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. But the train had already left the station, and there was no stopping what was about to unfold. Colbert's ego, bruised by Tarantino's dismissal, compelled him to dig the hole even deeper. "Well, if you're such a seasoned professional, then you should be able to discuss your work without throwing a tantrum like a child," he sneered. "This is exactly the kind of behavior people expect from someone who makes violent movies for a living. Maybe the violence in your film says more about your character than your artistic vision." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several audience members audibly gasped, and one person could be heard whispering, "Oh no," in the dead silence that followed. Tarantino's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then a cold, calculating anger that was genuinely frightening to witness. "You want to make this personal?" Tarantino asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the studio. "You want to attack my character? Let's talk about character, Stephen. Let's talk about a host who invites guests onto his show just so he can ambush them with gotcha questions designed to make himself look superior. Let's talk about someone who's built an entire career on mocking people who are actually trying to create something meaningful in this world." He stood up from his chair, towering over the seated host, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. "You sit behind that desk every night making jokes about people who are actually doing important work while you contribute absolutely nothing to the cultural conversation except cheap laughs and self-righteous grandstanding, and you have the audacity to question my character." The camera operators continued filming, though it was clear they were uncomfortable with what they were capturing. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a public evisceration happening in real time. Colbert, perhaps realizing too late that he had pushed too far, tried to backtrack with a weak smile. "Now, Quentin, I think we're both getting a little heated here. Maybe we should know." Tarantino's voice boomed through the studio, cutting off the host's pathetic attempt at reconciliation. "You don't get to start this fight and then try to play peacemaker when you realize you're losing. You questioned my integrity as an artist and as a person. You suggested that my life's work is somehow a reflection of some moral failing on my part. That's not journalism, Stephen. That's character assassination disguised as entertainment." The director began pacing behind his chair, his agitation growing with each word. "You know what the real problem is here? It's hosts like you who think that having a television show gives you the right to pass moral judgment on people who actually create art. You're not a critic. You're not a philosopher. And you're certainly not qualified to lecture anyone about responsibility or character. Members of the studio audience were beginning to look genuinely uncomfortable. Some shifting in their seats, others pulling out their phones to capture what they instinctively knew was going to be a viral moment. The energy in the room had become genuinely toxic, with both men now locked in a battle of egos that neither seemed willing to back down from. Colbert's face had gone from red to pale, and sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. He was clearly out of his depth, having expected his usual formula of provocative questions, followed by witty banter to work with Tarantino, as it had with countless other guests. Instead, he had encountered someone who refused to play by the unspoken rules of late-night television. Someone who was willing to call out the host's behavior in front of a live audience. "I think you're overreacting to what was intended as a thoughtful discussion," Colbert stammered. His usual confidence completely shattered, but his words only seemed to fuel Tarantino's anger further, setting the stage for an even more explosive continuation of their confrontation. Thoughtful discussion. Tarantino's voice cracked with incredulous laughter that bordered on maniacal. "You call that ambush journalism masquerading as intellectual discourse thoughtful? Stephen, you wouldn't recognize a thoughtful discussion if it walked up and introduced itself to you personally." He leaned forward, placing both hands on Colbert's desk, his face now inches from the trembling hosts. "What you just did was the equivalent of inviting someone to dinner and then spending the entire meal telling them their cooking is poison." The studio lights seemed to burn hotter as the tension reached unbearable levels. Several audience members had their phones out recording what they knew would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms. The production crew exchanged panicked glances, but nobody dared intervene in what had become a full-scale public humiliation. Colbert's hands visibly shook as he reached for his water glass, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he tried to swallow. "Quentin, I think maybe we should take a commercial break." And no commercial break. Tarantino slammed his palms down on the desk with such force that Colbert's note cards scattered across the floor. "You started this public execution, and now you're going to sit there and finish it like a man. You don't get to hide behind commercial breaks when your cheap shot backfires in your face." The director's face was flushed with righteous fury, his eyes blazing with the intensity of someone who had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. "You want to know what's really violent, Stephen? What's really damaging to society? It's hosts like you who destroy people's reputations for entertainment value. It's the way you sit behind that desk like some moral authority while you tear down artists who've spent their entire lives perfecting their craft." Members of the band looked on in horror from their corner of the stage, their instruments forgotten as they witnessed what would undoubtedly go down as one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history. The lead guitarist could be seen mouthing holy to the drummer while the keyboard player had his head in his hands. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to regain control of his own show. "Look, if I've offended you in some way, that wasn't my intention. I was simply trying to engage with the broader cultural conversation about—" "Shut up." Tarantino's roar echoed through the studio with such force that several people in the front row visibly flinched. "Just shut your lying mouth for once in your pathetic career. You weren't engaging with anything except your own ego and your desperate need to feel superior to people who actually matter in this industry." The director began circling around the desk like a predator stalking wounded prey, his movements deliberate and menacing. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Stephen? When I make something violent, it's clearly labeled as fiction. When you destroy someone's character on national television, you call it comedy and hide behind your audience's applause." Colbert's face had gone ashen, beads of sweat now clearly visible on his forehead under the harsh studio lights. His trademark smirk had been replaced by something approaching genuine fear as he realized the monster he had unleashed through his own arrogance and stupidity. "Every night you sit behind that desk and mock people who are trying to make a difference in the world," Tarantino continued, his voice taking on a preacher-like cadence that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. "Politicians, artists, activists. Anyone who dares to take a stand on something meaningful becomes fodder for your shallow jokes and your audience's programmed laughter." The silence in the studio was deafening, except for Tarantino's voice and the barely audible whir of the cameras that continued to capture every devastating moment. Even the usually responsive audience had fallen completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that had crossed far beyond the boundaries of typical television entertainment. "But tonight, Stephen, you picked the wrong target," Tarantino said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than all his previous shouting. "You thought you could ambush me like you've ambushed countless other guests who were too polite or too scared to call you out on You thought wrong." The director straightened up, smoothing down his suit jacket with deliberate, calculated movements. "You want to know what real violence looks like? It's what you just did to professional courtesy and basic human decency. It's the way you tried to assassinate my character in front of millions of people for no other reason than to feed your own massive ego." Colbert opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His face had taken on a grayish pallor, and his hands were gripping the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The man who had built his career on never being at a loss for words had been rendered completely speechless by the fury of someone he had grossly underestimated. "I've been in this business for over 3 decades, Tarantino continued, his voice now cold and controlled. "I've dealt with critics, protesters, censors, and every other type of person who thinks they know better than I do about my own work. But I have never, in all those years, encountered someone with the sheer audacity to invite me onto their show just so they could publicly disrespect me and everything I've worked for." The director took a step back from the desk, his eyes never leaving Colbert's terrified face. "Congratulations, Stephen. You've just achieved something truly remarkable. You've managed to make yourself look like a complete amateur in front of your own audience, on your own show, with your own cameras rolling." The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television history. Some viewers had stopped recording on their phones, too mesmerized by the raw intensity of what was unfolding before them to remember they were capturing it. Others continued filming, instinctively knowing they were documenting something that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. Tarantino straightened his tie with deliberate precision, his movements now calm and controlled in stark contrast to the explosive fury he had displayed moments earlier. The transformation was almost unsettling, like watching a hurricane suddenly turn into an eerie calm. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute finality. "You know what the most pathetic part of all this is, Stephen?" he asked, his tone now conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made his words even more devastating. "You actually thought you were clever. You thought you could trap me with your little gotcha questions and make yourself look like some kind of intellectual heavyweight. Instead, you've just proven to everyone watching that you're nothing more than a glorified bully with a television show." Colbert remained frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a man who had just watched his entire career implode in real time. Sweat had begun to stain his shirt collar, and his usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it during the confrontation. The confident, smirking persona that had made him famous had been completely obliterated, leaving behind only a shell of a man who had been thoroughly and publicly humiliated. The production team stood helplessly behind their cameras, uncertain whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial. The show's director, visible in the booth above the studio floor, could be seen frantically speaking into his headset, likely receiving instructions from network executives who were watching in horror as their star host was systematically destroyed on live television. Tarantino began walking toward the edge of the stage, but then stopped and turned back to face Colbert one final time. "I want you to remember this moment, Stephen," he said, his voice carrying across the dead silent studio. "I want you to remember what it feels like when someone with actual talent and integrity refuses to let you get away with your cheap, cowardly attacks, because that's what real courage looks like. Not hiding behind a desk making jokes about people who aren't there to defend themselves." He took a few more steps toward the exit, then paused again, as if struck by one final thought. "Oh, and Stephen, next time you want to have a thoughtful discussion about violence in entertainment, maybe you should look in the mirror first. What you did tonight was far more brutal than anything I've ever put in a movie, because at least my violence serves a purpose in telling a story. Your violence was just sadistic entertainment at someone else's expense." The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the studio equipment seemed deafeningly loud. Tarantino nodded once, a gesture that seemed to encompass both dismissal and pity, then turned and walked off the stage with the dignified bearing of someone who had just delivered a masterclass in how to handle professional disrespect. As his footsteps echoed through the studio and disappeared into the backstage area, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in for everyone present. Colbert remained motionless at his desk, staring at the spot where Tarantino had been standing, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The audience began to stir uncomfortably, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in stunned silence. The show's band leader, clearly sensing that someone needed to break the unbearable tension, began playing the show's outro music. But even that familiar sound seemed inappropriate and jarring in the aftermath of what had just transpired. Colbert mechanically turned toward the camera, his movements robotic and uncertain, but no words came out of his mouth. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, America watched as one of television's most confident hosts sat speechless and defeated behind his own desk. Finally, mercifully, the show cut to commercial, but the damage had already been done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were being uploaded to social media platforms where they would be viewed millions of times and spark countless debates about professionalism, respect, and the responsibility of talk show hosts. The incident would mark a turning point not just for Colbert's career, but for the entire late-night television landscape. Viewers who had grown accustomed to hosts ambushing their guests with provocative questions, designed more for viral moments than genuine conversation, suddenly found themselves questioning whether this type of entertainment was actually entertaining at all. In the days that followed, ratings for The Late Show would plummet as audiences either tuned out in disgust or paradoxically stayed away because they had lost respect for a host who had been so thoroughly dominated by his own guest. Industry insiders would spend weeks analyzing what had gone wrong and how such a seasoned television professional could have so catastrophically misjudged his opponent. But perhaps most importantly, the confrontation had served as a reminder that behind the carefully crafted personas and scripted banter of late-night television were real human beings with real feelings, real accomplishments, and real dignity that deserved to be respected. Quentin Tarantino had walked onto that stage as a guest and walked off as a legend who had refused to be diminished by someone who mistook cynicism for wisdom and cruelty for comedy. The entertainment industry would not soon forget the night that one of its most celebrated directors reminded everyone what it meant to stand up for artistic integrity and personal dignity, even when faced with public humiliation on national television.